Cabin is a chilling tale of a secluded cabin with a sinister past. A protagonist inherits the cabin, hoping for a peaceful escape, but soon encounters a series of unsettling events. Strange occurrences, a mysterious agent, and a chilling diary left by a previous occupant lead them to uncover a dark and dangerous secret lurking within the cabin's walls. As the protagonist delves deeper into the mystery, they realize they may be trapped in a terrifying supernatural ordeal. The city was starting to close in on them. Kenneth Parker had felt it the most. The endless routine of work, traffic, and noisy streets seemed to drain him a little more every day. He worked long hours as a project manager at a construction firm, where deadlines were always tight and his phone never stopped buzzing with emails and calls. His shoulders, perpetually tense, felt like they carried the weight of all his projects, clients, and his family. Even when he came home, the noise of the city filtered in through the windows: car horns, sirens, people shouting on the streets. It all became part of a background hum that he couldn't shut off. His wife, Emily, managed most of the household. Between her part-time job as a freelance graphic designer and taking care of their two children, Ella and Carl, she too felt the burden of city life. The kids were growing fast. Ella was 7, imaginative and curious, while Carl, 10, was entering that phase where everything and everyone seemed to annoy him. They were restless too. The same old routines were wearing on the entire family. One evening, Kenneth looked out of their apartment window at the gray buildings and the distant smog that hung over the city skyline. He felt it in his bones. He needed to get out. They all needed to get out. The idea of a holiday had been floating around for a while, but there was always an excuse: work, school, commitments. But this winter felt different. He couldn't pinpoint why, but it seemed necessary now. Urgent. He felt an unfamiliar restlessness growing inside him, as though something in the air was pushing him to leave the city and find somewhere quiet. That night, while the rest of the family was asleep, Kenneth sat up in bed with his laptop. He typed into the search bar, "Winter cabin rentals." The first few results were generic. Luxury cabins near ski resorts, fancy modern houses disguised as cabins with hot tubs and sweeping views. None of them felt right. He wanted something simple, rustic, something that felt far removed from the city and the hectic pace of life. His search became more focused. He added terms like secluded and deep woods. He clicked through page after page, growing tired, until finally something caught his eye. Whispering Pines Cabin, a place to escape. The listing was old, the photos blurry, but there was something about it that drew him in. The description promised a cozy, remote cabin deep in the woods, surrounded by towering pines. The cabin was advertised as a quiet place to disconnect from the modern world, a place where you could truly relax. No cell service, no distractions, just nature, snow, and the whisper of the trees. Kenneth stared at the screen for a moment. It was exactly what they needed. He clicked on the link, and the website opened to a minimalist page. There were only a few sentences about the cabin, no reviews, no detailed amenities. It seemed like the kind of place that had been forgotten by time, untouched by the flood of tourism. It was perfect. Feeling a sense of quiet excitement, he scrolled down and found a contact number. Without hesitating, he picked up his phone and dialed. The phone rang a few times before a voice answered. It was soft, almost too quiet. "Hello?" a woman said. "Yes, hi, I'm calling about the cabin, the one listed as Whispering Pines," Kenneth said, a little uncertain. The voice on the other end was so faint that he had to press the phone closer to his ear. "Yes," the woman replied slowly. "Whispering Pines. It's available, if you want it." There was something odd about the way she said it. Kenneth couldn't tell if it was just the phone line or something else, but he pushed the thought away. He was tired. It was late, and he just wanted to get this booked. "I'd like to reserve it," he said, "for 2 weeks, starting this Friday." A pause followed. It wasn't the kind of pause that meant the woman was checking a calendar or making arrangements. It was a heavy, lingering silence, as if she were considering something beyond his request. Finally, the woman spoke. "All right, the cabin will be ready for you, but are you sure you want to stay that long?" Kenneth felt a chill run down his spine, but he didn't know why. "Yes," he answered firmly. "We need the break." "Very well," she said, her voice soft as a whisper. "We'll see you Friday." Before he could ask anything more, the line clicked and the call ended. Kenneth set his phone down and stared at the screen for a moment longer, his finger hovering over the booking confirmation button. He felt a strange unease in the pit of his stomach, but he couldn't put a name to it. It was just a cabin. It was exactly what they needed. He hit the confirmation button and closed the laptop, feeling a sense of relief. The trip was booked. In a few days, they would be far away from the city, away from everything. The next morning, Kenneth told Emily about the cabin. She was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking her coffee and scrolling through her phone. The kids were getting ready for school, their backpacks tossed carelessly by the door. "I found a place," Kenneth said, pouring himself a cup of coffee and sitting down next to her. Emily looked up, surprised. "You did, already?" "Yeah, it's perfect. It's called Whispering Pines. It's about 4 hours away, in the middle of the woods. No cell service, it'll be just us and nature." Emily raised an eyebrow. "No cell? How are we going to survive without signal?" Kenneth laughed. "That's the point. We're always connected, always distracted. We need a break from it all. The kids can go 2 weeks without their tablets." Emily sipped her coffee thoughtfully. She liked the idea of a quiet getaway, but something about the way Kenneth described it made her uneasy. She had grown used to the conveniences of modern life, even in their small apartment. Could they really handle 2 weeks of isolation? Still, she saw how much Kenneth needed this. He had been more stressed lately, more distant. This could be good for all of them. "Okay," she said finally, "I'm in. But if the kids get out of hand, you're dealing with it." Kenneth grinned. "Deal." By Friday morning, the car was packed, and they were ready to go. Ella and Carl sat in the back seat, both a little grumpy about being pulled away from their devices. Ella had insisted on bringing her sketchbook and pencils, while Carl had snuck a handheld video game into his backpack, hoping his parents wouldn't notice. As they drove out of the city, the landscape began to change. The gray buildings and crowded streets gave way to open fields and winding roads. Snow covered the ground in a soft white blanket, and the trees became thicker as they headed deeper into the countryside. The further they went, the more the tension in Kenneth's shoulders began to melt away. "This is going to be fun," he said, glancing at Emily, who was staring out the window, lost in thought. "Yeah," she said quietly. "It'll be good to get away." The drive took them through small towns and long stretches of empty road. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to darken and a light snow started to fall. Ella and Carl grew quieter, both of them watching the world outside with wide eyes. The trees seemed to close in around them, their tall, dark shapes looming over the narrow road. "How much farther?" Carl asked, breaking the silence. "Not long now," Kenneth said. "Just another 30 minutes or so." But the last leg of the trip felt longer than it should have. The road wound deeper into the forest, and the snow began to fall harder, coating the trees and the ground in a thick white layer. The car's tires crunched over the snow, the sound eerily loud in the otherwise silent woods. "There's barely any signal out here," Emily said, holding up her phone. "I'm down to 1 bar." "That's the idea," Kenneth said with a grin. "We're off the grid." Finally, they rounded a bend in the road, and the cabin came into view. It stood alone at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by towering pine trees. The snow had piled up around it, making it look like something out of a postcard. It was smaller than it had looked in the photos, with dark wooden walls and a sloping roof. A narrow chimney poked out from the roof, and the windows were dark. "That's it?" Ella asked, sounding both excited and nervous. "That's it," Kenneth said, pulling the car into the clearing and parking near the front door. "Home sweet home for the next 2 weeks." They all stepped out of the car, their breath turning to mist in the cold air. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. It felt like the world had fallen away, leaving them alone in this small, frozen corner of the woods. Kenneth walked up to the front door and pulled out the key that had been mailed to them after the booking. The metal was cold in his hand as he unlocked the door and pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was exactly as the photos had shown, simple and rustic. There was a large stone fireplace in the center of the main room, with a stack of firewood neatly piled next to it. The furniture was old, but cozy wooden chairs with worn cushions, a small couch, and a low coffee table. The floors were covered in thick rugs, and the walls were lined with shelves full of books and old knickknacks. A pair of snowshoes hung on one wall, along with a mounted deer head that looked like it had been there for decades. The place had a certain charm, but it also felt like it had been untouched for years. Kenneth stepped inside, breathing in the musty smell of wood and dust. "It's perfect," he said, smiling at Emily. Emily walked in behind him, looking around cautiously. "It's quaint," she said, trying to hide her uncertainty. Ella and Carl followed, their eyes wide as they took in their surroundings. Ella immediately ran to the fireplace, her hands reaching out toward the logs. "Can we light a fire?" she asked eagerly. "Not yet," Kenneth said, setting their bags down on the floor. "Let's get settled first. We'll light a fire after we unpack." Carl, meanwhile, was less impressed. He wandered over to the window and looked out at the snow-covered trees. "There's no TV," he muttered, clearly displeased. "That's the point, Carl," Emily said gently. "We're here to disconnect, remember?" Carl rolled his eyes. "Yeah, great, disconnect." Kenneth walked over to him and put a hand on his shoulder. "Hey, it's going to be fun. We'll explore the woods, play some games, build a snowman like Ella wants. You'll see it'll be a nice break." Carl didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue either. As the family settled into the cabin, the light outside began to fade, and the temperature dropped even further. Kenneth and Carl brought in the rest of the bags from the car while Emily and Ella unpacked in the small bedrooms. The cabin had 2 bedrooms, one for Kenneth and Emily, and one for the kids, who would share a bunk bed. The rooms were small but cozy, with thick blankets on the beds and old-fashioned oil lamps on the nightstands. After everything was unpacked, Kenneth lit a fire in the fireplace. The flames crackled and hissed as they climbed up the dry logs, casting a warm orange glow across the room. The heat from the fire spread quickly, filling the cabin with a comforting warmth. The family gathered around the fire, sitting on the couch and chairs, sipping hot chocolate that Emily had made. For the first time in what felt like forever, there were no distractions, no phones, no emails, no meetings to rush to. Just the sound of the fire and the soft rustling of the wind outside. "This is nice," Emily said, leaning back in her chair and closing her eyes. "Just what we needed." Kenneth smiled, feeling a sense of calm settle over him. He hadn't realized just how much he had needed this until now. The quiet, the isolation, it was exactly what they had been missing. Ella was curled up on the couch, her sketchbook open on her lap as she doodled by the firelight. Carl, though still skeptical, had started to relax too. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring into the flames, lost in thought. For a while, they all sat in silence, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. But as the evening wore on, and the fire began to die down, Kenneth noticed something strange. The wind outside had picked up, and it was howling now, louder than before. It didn't sound like a normal. Kenneth shook his head, trying to brush off the feeling. He was just being paranoid. "We should get some sleep," he said, turning back to the family. "It's been a long day." Emily nodded, yawning as she stood up. "Good idea. It's been a long drive." They all headed to their rooms, the fire dying down to embers behind them. Kenneth closed the door to their bedroom and climbed into bed beside Emily, pulling the thick blankets up to his chin. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the fireplace in the other room. As he lay there, listening to the wind howl outside, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The cabin was so isolated, so far removed from the world, that it felt like they had stepped into another reality, one where the rules were different, and things lurked in the shadows, just out of sight. He turned over, trying to get comfortable, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, made him tense up. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and Kenneth drifted into an uneasy sleep. In the middle of the night, Kenneth woke suddenly. The room was pitch black, and for a moment he couldn't remember where he was. Then it all came rushing back, the cabin, the woods, the strange wind. He sat up in bed, listening. The wind had stopped. The cabin was completely silent, too silent. Kenneth glanced at the window. The curtains were drawn, but he could feel something outside, watching. He climbed out of bed as quietly as he could, careful not to wake Emily, and crept over to the window. Slowly, he pulled back the curtain just a crack and peered out. The clearing outside was empty, covered in a thick layer of snow. The trees stood still, their branches heavy with frost. But just beyond the edge of the clearing where the woods began, Kenneth thought he saw something move. A shadow. Something tall and thin, standing just out of sight. His breath caught in his throat, and he let the curtain fall back into place, his heart pounding in his chest. He stood there for a moment, trying to calm himself. It was just his imagination. There was nothing out there, nothing. But as he turned to go back to bed, he heard it. A faint whisper, carried on the wind. "Welcome," it said, barely audible but unmistakable. Kenneth froze, his blood turning to ice. He stood there, rooted to the spot, listening, but the whisper didn't come again. Finally, he forced himself to move. He climbed back into bed, pulling the blankets up to his chin, his heart racing. He lay there for what felt like hours, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the whisper to return. But it didn't. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and Kenneth drifted off into a restless sleep, haunted by the sound of that single word echoing in his mind. Welcome. The next morning, Kenneth woke up with a deep sense of unease. He kept replaying the events of the night before in his head, especially the strange whisper that had echoed through the cabin. Welcome. The voice had seemed so real, so clear, but he tried convincing himself it had to be his imagination. The isolation of the cabin and the howling wind were probably just messing with his mind. Still, the feeling lingered, gnawing at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. Emily was already awake, moving quietly around the cabin. She stood in the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of strong black coffee. As she busied herself with breakfast, Kenneth sat up, shaking off the remnants of a sleepless night. His eyes were drawn to the window, where the pale light of the morning barely penetrated the thick gray clouds. Snow still covered the ground, but now a cold drizzle had started to fall, making the entire scene outside look even more bleak. Suddenly, Emily's voice broke through his thoughts. "Oh no, Kenneth," she said, her voice edged with worry. Kenneth turned to her, frowning. "What's wrong?" "We forgot to stop in the city for cereal for the kids," Emily said, her tone filled with frustration. Kenneth sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. I told you to just grab the cereal from home. Where am I supposed to find a market out here?" "I don't know," Emily replied, her eyes wide with worry. "But we need to find something. The kids won't have anything to eat otherwise." Kenneth groaned but nodded, standing up and grabbing his jacket. "All right, I'll go see if I can find a store in one of the nearby towns. But I doubt I'll find anything too close." Emily gave him a grateful smile, but Kenneth could tell she was as uneasy as he was. There was something about the cabin and the surrounding woods that made them both feel off balance, like the air itself was thicker, harder to breathe. As Kenneth stepped outside, the wind hit him like a slap. It was icy, biting through his clothes and chilling him to the bone. He shivered, pulling his jacket tighter as he made his way to the car. The rain, mixed with sleet, made visibility poor as he drove down the long, winding driveway leading away from the cabin. The woods around him seemed darker than they had the day before, the trees looming like silent watchers. About halfway down the hill, Kenneth glanced in his rearview mirror. His heart skipped a beat. There, standing in the middle of the road behind him, was an old woman. She was hunched over, her tattered shawl flapping in the wind, her eyes locked on his car. For a moment, Kenneth felt frozen, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tight. He blinked, but when he looked again, the woman was gone. Kenneth slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. He stared into the mirror, scanning the road and the woods beyond. There was no one there. "What the hell?" he muttered, running a hand through his hair. He had barely slept the night before, his mind troubled by the strange events in the cabin. Maybe his exhaustion was making him see things. Or maybe he shook his head, refusing to follow that line of thought. He had to get a grip. It was just his imagination. It had to be. After driving for nearly an hour through the winding forest roads, Kenneth finally spotted a small town up ahead. It was quiet, eerily quiet. The houses and shops looked old, their exterior weathered and worn, as though the town had been left behind by time. There were no people on the streets, no cars parked along the road. It was as if the entire place had been abandoned. Kenneth's unease deepened, but he had no choice. The kids needed cereal, and this was the only town he had seen. He pulled up in front of a small market, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The wooden sign above the door creaked in the wind, and the windows were dusty and dark. Inside, the market was dimly lit and smelled faintly of mildew. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with old rustic items, things that looked like they belonged in a different era. Kenneth grabbed a box of cereal, noticing how out of place it seemed among the other goods. As he approached the counter, he saw an old man sitting there, reading a newspaper. The man stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Kenneth. "You must be new around here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I ain't seen you before." Kenneth nodded, trying to keep things casual despite the growing knot in his stomach. "Yeah, we're staying at a cabin about 100 kilometers from here. Just came into town to grab some supplies." The old man stared at him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. "Cabin, huh? You're talking about that place in the woods, ain't you?" Kenneth shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, why?" The old man leaned forward, his face suddenly serious. "You need to get your family out of there. That place, it ain't safe." Kenneth blinked, taken aback by the man's sudden change in tone. "What do you mean?" "We're fine. It's just a cabin in the woods." The old man shook his head, his eyes dark. "That cabin's got a history. Bad things happen there. Folks disappear. If I were you, I'd leave while you still can." Kenneth felt a chill run down his spine. The man's words hung in the air like a warning, but Kenneth didn't want to believe them. He forced a smile, trying to brush off the unease that had settled deep in his chest. "We'll be fine," he said, handing over the money for the cereal. "Thanks for the warning, though." The old man's eyes stayed fixed on him as he bagged the cereal. "Don't say I didn't warn you. That cabin, it's got a mind of its own." Kenneth nodded, though the words made his skin crawl. He took the bag, gave a quick nod, and hurried out of the market. As he stepped outside, the cold wind hit him again, biting at his face. He looked around, expecting to see anyone, but the town was still eerily deserted. As Kenneth drove back to the cabin, the old man's warning echoed in his mind. He couldn't shake the man's words, the way his voice had sounded so certain, so full of dread. Bad things happen there. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, glancing into the rearview mirror again. The image of the old woman standing in the road flashed in his mind, her empty eyes staring at him. It had to have been a trick of the light, a figment of his imagination. But no matter how much he tried to convince himself, the pit in his stomach grew deeper. When he pulled up to the cabin, the sight of its dark wooden frame looming in the distance sent a shiver down his spine. The windows stared back at him like black, soulless eyes. He parked the car and got out, the cold wind howling through the trees. As he made his way to the door, the eerie silence of the woods pressed in around him. Kenneth paused at the doorstep, looking back toward the road. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, a tall, dark silhouette. But when he blinked, it was gone. His heart raced as he stepped inside the cabin, shutting the door behind him. The warmth of the fire greeted him, but the unease in his chest remained. "Did you find the cereal?" Emily called from the kitchen, her voice a welcome distraction from the gnawing dread that had settled deep within him. "Yeah," Kenneth replied, his voice hollow. "I got it." But even as he handed her the cereal, the old man's words lingered in his mind. That cabin's got a mind of its own. And for the first time, Kenneth wondered if there was something far darker lurking in the woods around them than he could ever have imagined. Kenneth hurried back to the cabin, the old man's words gnawing at his mind. By the time he returned, the wind had picked up, sending howling gusts through the trees. He parked the car and stepped into the cabin, shaking off the cold. The warmth from the fire greeted him, but something about it felt wrong, almost too hot, too bright. He shook off the thought, trying to appear calm for Emily's sake. Emily was sitting by the fireplace, pouring 2 glasses of wine. She looked up and smiled as Kenneth entered, but the unease hadn't left her eyes. "How was the drive? Did you find the cereal?" Kenneth forced a smile and nodded, setting the box on the counter. "Yeah, found a small market an hour away. Place looked deserted though." "Deserted?" Emily asked, handing him a glass of wine as he sat next to her on the sofa. "What do you mean?" Kenneth took a sip of the wine, feeling its warmth spread through him. He hesitated, glancing at the flickering flames in the fireplace. They seemed off, like the fire was moving in unnatural patterns, twisting in ways it shouldn't. I mean, the whole town felt empty. There was an old man at the market, though. Gave me some strange advice. Strange advice? Emily leaned in, curious now. Kenneth sighed, staring into the fire. He told me we shouldn't stay here. Said the cabin wasn't safe. He paused, the old man's words echoing in his head. I didn't want to worry you, but something about this place feels off. Emily's smile faded. She glanced around the cabin, the shadows seeming longer and darker now that the evening had set in. The fire crackled, the flames licking up toward the chimney, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Maybe it's just the storm, or the fact we're so far from civilization. As she spoke, the fire suddenly flared, sending a burst of heat through the room. Both Kenneth and Emily jumped back, startled. The flames roared higher for a moment, then died down, returning to their normal flicker. Kenneth's heart pounded. He set his glass of wine down on the coffee table, his mind racing. That wasn't normal, right? You saw that? Emily nodded, her face pale. Ken, maybe we should listen to what that old man said. Maybe we should leave. Before Kenneth could answer, a deep groan echoed through the cabin, like wood shifting under pressure. The fire dimmed again, the light flickering wildly as if something were moving within the flames. Then from upstairs came a soft, unmistakable sound like someone was walking above them. Kenneth and Emily froze, their eyes meeting in silent terror. Neither of them spoke, but they both knew whatever was in the cabin with them wasn't human.
Please like and subscribe for more terrifying tales.